They didn't save her a seat at her own father's funeral. Her husband sat up front beside a woman Renee recognized from his phone. Her mother-in-law whispered something that made the whole row smile. Renee sat alone in the back, and smiled too. Nobody understood why, not yet. The church smelled like old wood and fresh flowers. White lilies lined the altar in neat rows, and the morning light came through the stained glass in long amber columns that fell across the pews, like something holy was trying to say something. It was the kind of church Theodore Okafor had attended every Sunday for 31 years. The kind where everybody knew his name, where the ushers shook his hand at the door, and the pastor called him Brother Theodore with genuine warmth. He had been a principal, a quiet man, a man who believed that the way you carried yourself in hard moments said everything about who you actually were. He raised one daughter. He raised her to understand that. Renee sat in the fourth pew from the back. She had arrived early. She had dressed carefully. Black dress, simple cut, no excess. She wore her hair pulled back the way her father always said looked elegant. She carried nothing in her hands except a small folded program the usher gave her at the door, the one with her father's photograph on the front. She looked at that photograph for a long moment before she sat down. Theodore Okafor, age 61, 30 years in education, beloved father. The photograph was one she had chosen herself, from a Sunday 3 years ago when the light had caught him just right, and he was laughing at something her cousin said. He looked free in that picture. She had wanted people to see him that way, free, not formal. The front row was already full when she arrived. She noticed it immediately, the way you notice when something is wrong before your mind has fully named what the wrong thing is. Marcus was seated in the family row, first pew on the left, right behind where the pastor would stand. He had on a dark suit she had never seen before. He sat with his shoulders squared and his chin slightly lifted, the way he sat when he wanted to appear composed. Beside him, not behind him, not across the aisle, beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched, was a woman in a navy dress. Deja. Renee had seen her face in Marcus's phone 11 months ago, in a message thread she wasn't supposed to see, in a conversation that used language you don't use with someone who is simply a colleague. She had never said his name out loud in connection with that woman's. She had kept it inside herself the way you keep a splinter, aware of it constantly, unable to ignore the pressure, but not yet ready for what removing it would require. Renee did not walk to the front row. She found her seat in the back, settled into it quietly, and folded her hands in her lap. An older woman she didn't recognize gave her a sympathetic nod. Renee nodded back. She kept her eyes forward. Gloria, Marcus's mother, was seated 2 spots down from her son. Gloria was 58 years old and had the kind of posture that communicated opinion without words. She had never extended warmth toward Renee, not because Renee had done anything specific to earn her coldness, but because Renee had never needed her approval, and women like Gloria experienced that independence as a form of rejection. During the opening prayer, Renee watched Gloria lean toward her daughter Felicia and whisper something close to her ear. Felicia pressed her lips together to suppress a smile. The woman beside Felicia caught it and looked down. Small smiles traveled down the row like a quiet current. Renee watched all of it from the back. She did not look away. She simply observed, the way her grandfather had always told her to observe, without reaction, without performance, with full attention. The pastor began the eulogy. He spoke about Theodore the way people speak about men who lived with integrity, not perfectly but honestly. He said Theodore always believed in quiet strength. He quoted something Theodore used to say to his students, that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most powerful one. He said Theodore had a particular gift for recognizing what was real in people underneath all the performance and positioning, and that he spent his whole career trying to draw that real thing out of young people who had been told it wasn't there. The congregation responded warmly. There were sounds of agreement, soft amens, the occasional sob from somewhere in the middle rows. Then the pastor said it. He said, "Theodore always told me his greatest treasure walked quietly." Renee's jaw tightened. Just once. A small, involuntary thing. The kind of physical response that happens when grief finds a new angle to enter from. Her hand found the edge of the pew and held it. She counted 3 seconds. Then she released it. She straightened her spine. She looked back at her father's photograph on the program and held it there until her breathing returned to something even. After the service, people gathered outside in the warm morning air. There were conversations, embraces, the slow dispersal of a community that had loved a man and was now learning to exist without him. Renee accepted condolences from her father's colleagues and former students with grace. She shook hands. She thanked people for coming. She was present in the way that takes enormous energy to sustain, the kind of presence that looks like calm from the outside and feels like holding your breath from the inside. Marcus approached her near the bottom of the church steps. He had his hands in his pockets, which was something he did when he was rehearsing what to say. He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read over 4 years of marriage. Not guilt exactly, something more like inconvenience. Like her feelings were a logistical problem he needed to manage. He said, "We need to talk about the house this week." Renee looked at him. She took her time. She held his gaze without hurry, without heat, with the kind of stillness that had always made him slightly uncomfortable because he could never fully read it. And then she said, "There's no rush, Marcus. Everything will be settled very soon." He nodded, clearly assuming she meant the divorce, assuming she was resigned, assuming this was a woman preparing to negotiate from a position of loss. He said something about his attorney being reasonable, and then someone called his name from across the parking lot, and he turned and walked toward whoever it was. Deja was already by his car. She did not look in Renee's direction. Renee drove home alone. She did not turn on the radio. She sat inside 30 minutes of complete silence, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes on the road ahead. The narrator wants you to know something about that silence. It was not the silence of a woman who had nothing left. It was the silence of a woman who had already begun. To understand Renee Okafor, you have to understand where she came from. And that begins not with money, not with status, but with a kitchen table in a modest house on the east side of the city, where Theodore Okafor used to sit across from his daughter on Sunday evenings and ask her one question. What did you learn about yourself this week? Not about school, not about grades, about herself. He believed that self-knowledge was the foundation everything else had to be built on. You couldn't be shaken if you knew who you were. You couldn't be redefined by someone else's story about you if you were already fluent in your own. Elias Okafor, Theodore's father, Renee's grandfather, was a different kind of man. Quieter even than Theodore, which was saying something. He had built things in the 1970s when building things as a black man required a particular combination of patience, precision, and willingness to move without announcement. Real estate first, then investments, then a holdings company that he structured carefully, deliberately over decades, with the kind of long-view thinking that doesn't seek validation because it doesn't need any. He drove the same car for 14 years. He wore the same watch, a simple gold one, for 40. The family knew he had something. They didn't know what. He never told them. He told Renee once that the size of a man's ambition was nobody's business until it was time for it to be. On the night of Renee's 21st birthday, Elias sat with her alone after everyone else had gone home. He had an envelope in his hand. He set it on the table between them and he said, "I've been watching you your whole life. the way you move, the way you think. You have the thing that cannot be taught. He slid the envelope toward her. Read this when you're ready, and when you're ready, call Bernard Cole. He wrote a phone number on the back of the envelope in his careful handwriting. Then he stood, kissed her forehead, and said goodnight. The letter inside that envelope had been read so many times the paper had softened at the folds. Renee never showed it to Marcus. She kept it in a place he didn't know about, the way you keep certain things, not out of secrecy but out of knowing that some things belong only to you. Marcus was not always the man he became. 3 years into their marriage, at a family dinner on his side, his brother Andre had made a dismissive joke about something Renee said, waved her opinion off the way men sometimes do when they don't realize what they're revealing about themselves. Marcus had looked across the table with steady eyes and said, "She's the smartest person in this room. Don't do that again." Not loudly, not performatively, just clearly, the way you speak when you mean something completely. Renee had loved him more in that moment than at any other point in their relationship. She had filed it away in the part of her that believed in him. She had supported him through 2 job losses without making him feel diminished by either one. When his consulting business failed after 14 months, she had not said, "I told you so," even though she had told him the market wasn't ready. She had simply helped him figure out the next step. When he went through a period that he called stress and she recognized as something closer to depression, she had stayed close without smothering, had made space without disappearing. She had loved him with the kind of love that does not announce itself because it is too busy being present. So when she saw that woman's name in his phone, the thread that used the language of people who had crossed a line and decided to keep walking, the devastation was not just about betrayal, it was about the revision, about having to go back through every memory and ask, which parts were real? It was a particular kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name, and Renee had carried it quietly for 11 months before her father died and everything accelerated. In the 3 weeks before Theodore passed, Renee had made 2 trips. The first was to Bernard Cole's office, the attorney whose number her grandfather had written on the back of an envelope 5 years earlier. The second was to Elias's estate, a property outside the city that the family had always vaguely known existed but had never been invited to examine. She told no one about either trip. She had paperwork to handle. That was all anyone needed to know. 8 days after the funeral, Marcus filed for divorce. The papers arrived through his attorney, a firm that billed aggressively and moved fast, which told Renee everything she needed to know about how Marcus had been advised to approach this. The filing made asset claims on the house, on shared accounts, on property that his attorney clearly believed was jointly held. The legal positioning assumed Renee had nothing of her own. It assumed she was negotiating from zero. The papers sat on her kitchen table for one evening. She read every page carefully. Then she called Bernard Cole. Renee did not respond publicly to any of it. She didn't post anything. She didn't call Marcus's family to defend herself. She didn't reach out to mutual friends. The family group chat, which she was still technically part of, had grown loud in the days after the filing. She had seen a screenshot of a message from one of Marcus's cousins describing her as someone who always acted like she was above everybody. She took a screenshot of that message. She saved it. She said nothing. At Gloria's house, 2 weeks after the funeral, Renee arrived to collect some of her father's belongings that had been stored there after a family gathering months earlier. She had called ahead. Gloria met her at the door with the particular politeness of someone who wants you to know they're tolerating your presence. There were 4 people in the living room, family members she recognized, people who had watched her marriage with the kind of interest that waits for failure. She was gathering her father's things from the hallway closet when Gloria appeared in the doorway and said, in front of all 4 of them, "You know, Theodore would have wanted Marcus to be happy. Renee stopped. The narrator wants to slow this moment down for you, to let you sit inside it the way Renee sat inside it. She stood with her father's items in her hands, and in the space of about 4 seconds, she assembled and rejected 3 separate responses. All 3 were true. All 3 would have landed with the precision of something that cannot be taken back. She could have mentioned what she knew. She could have said anything at all, and the room would have shifted. She chose none of it. She turned to Gloria with a face that held nothing hostile, just composure, clean and complete, and said, "Thank you for letting me get his things." She picked up her father's framed photograph, tucked it under her arm, and walked out. She drove to her apartment, the one she had moved into quietly, 3 weeks before the divorce papers came, when she had understood that the end was not coming, but had already arrived. She had said nothing about the move to Marcus's family. She had simply arranged it. That night, after Gloria's house, she sat on the floor with her back against the bed and her father's photograph in her lap, and she cried. Not the kind of crying that releases something, the kind that comes out after you've been holding it longer than a person should have, to hold something. She cried for her father, who deserved more time. She cried for the marriage she had genuinely tried to save. She cried for the version of herself that had believed for 11 months that maybe she was wrong about what she saw in that phone. She gave that grief its full space, didn't rush it, didn't perform past it. She sat on the floor until she was empty. Then she stood up. She washed her face. She opened her laptop. She sent one email to Bernard Cole. 3 words. "It's time. Ready." 10 days after that, Marcus appeared on a local lifestyle blog, a rooftop event, arm around Deja, smiling the kind of smile you perform for cameras when you want people to understand you're doing well. The caption said, "Moving forward." It was shared through the family network within hours. Gloria liked it within seconds of the tag. Felicia added a heart. The post accumulated warmth from people who had smiled in that front row pew, from people who had whispered at the funeral, from people who had decided the story and were now celebrating what they believed was its conclusion. Renee saw the post. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed her phone and went to sleep. The estate reading for Elias Okafor was scheduled 34 days after Theodore's funeral, at the offices of Bernard Cole and Associates, a firm that occupied a quiet floor of a downtown building with dark wood paneling and the kind of unhurried atmosphere that belongs to spaces where significant things are decided without urgency. All named beneficiaries had been formally notified. Legal representatives were expected. It was procedural. It was supposed to be brief. Marcus was not supposed to be there. But word had traveled, the way word travels through family networks, imprecise and slightly inflated, that Renee might receive something from her grandfather's estate. Nothing specific, just something. His attorney, a man named Preston who favored aggressive timelines, advised him to send a representative as a precaution, just to monitor, just to understand how any assets Renee received might affect the divorce calculation. Marcus decided to come himself. He told himself it was strategic. The narrator suspects he was also curious. He brought Deja, which told you everything about his judgment in this period of his life. They arrived early, which was something Marcus did when he wanted to appear in control of a room. Preston sat beside him. Deja sat one seat back, composed in the way she was always composed, watchful, positioning herself correctly without making it visible. 2 of Elias's other descendants were present. Cousins Renee barely knew, represented by their own counsel, people who had come expecting modest distributions from a modest estate. Bernard Cole's assistant offered water. The room settled into the particular quiet of people waiting for something to begin. Renee arrived last. She came through the door at exactly the appointed time. Not a minute early, not a minute late. She wore a navy dress, not by accident. The same color Deja had worn at the funeral, in the seat that should have been hers. She had chosen it deliberately and quietly, the way she did everything deliberately and quietly. Her hair was pulled back. She wore no jewelry except a bracelet. Old, simple, gold, the one Elias had given her years ago, the one that matched the watch he wore for 40 years. She greeted Bernard Cole with a nod that communicated fluency, the nod of someone who had been in this office before, who understood exactly what was about to happen, who had helped arrange it. She walked to the head of the table and sat down. Marcus's attorney leaned toward him immediately and whispered something. Marcus looked at the head of the table. He looked at Renee. He looked back at Preston. Something crossed his face. A flicker of recalculation. But he settled it quickly. He assumed it was a mistake. He assumed someone would correct the seating. He almost said something. He did not. Bernard Cole opened the proceedings with the formal language that estate attorneys use. Clear, precise, unhurried. He acknowledged the parties present. He noted the date of Elias Okafor's passing and the subsequent legal processes that had followed. He confirmed that the documentation was complete and had been reviewed by all necessary parties in advance. Then he opened the folder in front of him. He read the standard designations first. Small distributions to 2 charitable organizations Elias had supported for decades, a modest bequest to a cousin who had cared for him in his final months. Then he reached the primary designation. He looked up once, briefly, at no one in particular, and then he read it. The entirety of the Okafor Holdings Group, its assets, subsidiaries, real estate portfolio, and controlling interest in 4 legacy investment funds, has been left exclusively to Renee Okafor, granddaughter of Elias, in recognition of her demonstrated character, discretion, and readiness. He paused. Not for effect, just for breath. This designation was formalized 18 months ago. All documentation is in order. The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Not the quiet of people being polite, the quiet of people whose mental framework has just encountered something it doesn't have a folder for. One of the distant cousins looked at his attorney. The attorney looked at his notes. Deja, 1 seat back and slightly to the right, became very still in the particular way of someone who is rapidly reassessing everything they believed they understood about a situation. Preston, Marcus's attorney, moved first. He slid a business card across the table toward Bernard Cole, a professional gesture, the opening move of someone attempting to insert themselves into a proceeding they have no standing in. Bernard looked at the card. He picked it up. He returned it without expression and said, plainly and without hostility, "Counsel, your client has no standing in this proceeding." Marcus looked at Renee. She was reviewing a document in front of her. She did not look up. Bernard continued. He stated the total assessed value of the Okafor Holdings estate in the same tone he had used for everything else. Measured, matter of fact, as though the number were simply data, which, to him it was. $18.3 billion. The number landed in the room the way large true things land. Not with fanfare, but with weight. A specific, undeniable weight that reorganizes the space around it. Deja stood up. She did it quietly, without announcement. Simply rose from her chair the way you rise when you realize you are in the wrong room and have been for some time. She gathered her bag. She did not make eye contact with Marcus. She did not speak. She walked to the door and she left. And the door closed behind her with a soft, final sound that everyone heard and no one commented on. Marcus watched her go. The narrator wants to stay in this moment, not to punish Marcus, but to be honest about what was actually happening inside it. because Marcus was not a cartoonish man. He was a man who had made choices, significant, damaging, irreversible choices. But he was also a man who had once looked across a dinner table and defended the woman now sitting at the head of this room with a composure he had never been able to manufacture for himself. He was a man who had let someone else rewrite the story of his marriage until he believed the revision. And now he sat in a chair in a room that was not organized the way he had expected it to be, watching the woman he had filed divorce papers against sit at the head of an $18 billion estate, and something in him understood, fully, with no remaining ambiguity, exactly what he had done. His silence was not theatrical. It was the silence of genuine reckoning. The narrator will not mock him for it. It is the most honest thing he did in this entire story. Renee looked up from the document. She found Marcus's eyes directly without searching. She knew exactly where he was sitting, had known since she walked in. She looked at him the way you look at something you once loved and have finally, completely let go of. Not with anger, not with triumph, with a clarity that had no room in it for performance. She said, "You filed for the house. Bernard, can you show him which assets include that property?" Bernard opened a secondary folder. He turned several pages. He pointed to a section and read the relevant notation aloud. The house, along with the land it sat on, had been held inside an Okafor Holdings land trust for 60 years. It had never been jointly owned. It had never been in Marcus's name. It had never been eligible for the claims his attorney had filed. Marcus had built an entire legal strategy on an asset that was never his to claim. Preston closed his folder. Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say. The paperwork said it all in the careful language of a man, Elias Okafor, who had structured everything precisely because he understood that precision was protection, and that the right kind of protection installed early enough becomes invisible until the moment it's needed. The meeting concluded with the procedural efficiency of a firm that does not engage in theater. Signatures were gathered. Documents were distributed. Bernard Cole shook Renee's hand at the conclusion with the warmth of someone who had watched a long thing finally reach its correct resolution. The other parties filed out. Marcus and Preston were the last to leave. At the door, Marcus paused. He didn't turn all the way around. He stood at the threshold for 2 seconds. The narrator counted, and then he walked out. What followed was not a collapse. It was an unraveling, and there is a difference. A collapse is sudden and loud. An unraveling is quiet and thorough and takes exactly as long as it takes. Marcus's divorce filing became part of the public record as divorce filings do. The asset claim on a property that had never belonged to him became known in legal circles, not as a scandal, but as an error of the kind that follows a man the way quiet errors do, mentioned in side conversations, noted by people who track these things. His professional network, the one that had admired his apparent new beginning and celebrated the rooftop photograph, began a gradual and polite recalibration, not because they were loyal to Renee. Most of them had never considered her particularly carefully, but because proximity to that kind of miscalculation at that scale made people nervous. People who managed their careers carefully did not want their names near it. Deja did not make a scene. She was not that kind of person. She simply realigned, the way practical people realign when the landscape shifts. Within 3 weeks, she was photographed at an event without Marcus. Her social presence, which had briefly placed him in the background of 2 carefully composed images, went quiet on the subject of him. The narrator does not assign her pure villainy. She had been given a version of Marcus, the version he had performed when he needed to believe his own narrative. And she had responded to that performance. When the performance was over, there was nothing underneath it she had signed up for. She was not a good person in this story, but she was a comprehensible one. Gloria and the extended family, the ones who had smiled in the front row, the ones who had liked the blog post within seconds, the ones who had whispered at the funeral that this was Marcus finally making a mature decision, found themselves in the particular discomfort of people who had declared allegiance to the wrong story in public. There was no dramatic confrontation. No one came for them. They simply had to live inside the knowledge of what they had chosen, and social knowledge of that kind has a long half-life. People remembered. People always remember who smiled and when. Marcus called Renee once. It was a Tuesday evening about 6 weeks after the estate reading. She saw his name on the screen and let it go to voicemail. He left a message. The narrator will not play it for you. Some things deserve privacy even inside their consequences, but will tell you that it existed and that it lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and that it was the most unperformed thing Marcus had said in years. Renee listened to it once, sitting in the kitchen of her apartment, her father's photograph visible on the shelf across the room. She listened to all 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Then she deleted it. Not out of cruelty, out of the understanding that some doors, once correctly closed, do not need to be revisited. She had her own grief to finish. She did not need his to complete it. 6 months after the estate reading, Renee Okafor moved into the offices of Okafor Holdings as its chief executive. She had spent those 6 months learning, sitting with Bernard Cole's team, understanding the portfolios and the subsidiaries and the investment structures that her grandfather had built across 5 decades. She approached it the way she approached everything, methodically, without performance, with the kind of patience that understands that competence must be earned even when authority has been granted. The office they prepared for her was warm. She had insisted on that. She had seen executive spaces that were cold by design, all glass and deliberate emptiness, engineered to intimidate. And she had said no to all of it. Her office had plants, natural light, a large wooden desk that had belonged to Elias, that the estate team had offered her and that she had accepted without hesitation. On the credenza behind her desk sat her father's framed photograph, Theodore at that Sunday gathering laughing, free. On the wall beside her degrees hung a frame containing Elias's letter, the one from the night of her 21st birthday, the one with the paper softened at the folds. It was behind glass now, preserved, but she knew every word of it by heart and did not need to read it to remember what it said. The bracelet on her wrist was the same one she had worn to the estate reading. She wore it every day, not to signal anything to anyone, just because it connected her to the man who had seen her before she fully saw herself. And that connection was worth carrying. There was a morning, about 3 weeks into her time in the office, when she sat alone in the early quiet before the day began, coffee in hand, looking out the window at the city below. The narrator wants you to sit in this moment too, because it is the one where everything resolves. Not externally. Externally, things had resolved weeks ago in a conference room with legal documents and a door closing softly. This was the internal resolution, the one that happens quietly with no audience, in the early morning light. She thought about her father, about the way he used to ask her what she had learned about herself that week, about the fact that she would never be able to answer that question directly to him again, and that she would be answering it for the rest of her life in the way she chose to live it. She thought about Elias driving his old car, wearing his old watch, building something enormous in the kind of silence that powerful things grow in. She thought about the church pew she had sat in alone and the hand that had gripped the wood for 3 seconds and then released. She thought about the floor of her apartment and the crying that had finally come out. And she understood something her father had been trying to teach her from the beginning, that the opposite of powerlessness is not aggression. It is not revenge. It is not the loud, satisfying collapse of the people who underestimated you. The opposite of powerlessness is simply becoming, completely and without apology, what you were always going to be. Everything else arranges itself around that. She had not become powerful at the estate reading. The narrator said it before and will say it again because it is the truest thing in this entire story. She had become visible. The power was always there, built in a kitchen on Sunday evenings by a man who asked the right questions, planted in an envelope by a man who understood timing, grown in 11 months of silence and strategic patience and grief and clarity. The estate reading had not created anything. It had simply revealed what was already fully formed underneath. The final image mirrors the first. At her father's funeral, she sat in the back of the church because nobody saved her a seat. This morning, she sits at the head of something her grandfather built, and her father believed in, and she has claimed with everything she learned from both of them. There is nobody to give her credit, nobody to applaud the moment. It is simply her in a warm office with a coffee cup and a view of the city and the absolute, unshakable knowledge of who she is. The narrator closes here with 4 quiet truths that this story tried to carry from beginning to end. Dignity is not something you demand from people. It is not something you perform for the crowd or defend in public arguments. Dignity is what you refuse to surrender, even when the cost of keeping it feels enormous. Renee kept hers through a funeral, a divorce filing, a family group chat, a living room with 4 witnesses, and a floor she sat on alone. She kept it every single time. And when the moment came, it was the foundation everything else stood on. Silence is not weakness. The narrator wants this one to land because it is the one most likely to be misunderstood in a world that rewards noise. Renee had 3 responses ready in Gloria's hallway. She had things she could have said at the church. She had the rooftop blog post sitting in her phone. She used none of it, because she understood that the right silence at the right time is not absence. It is strategy. It is patience with a plan inside it. What is truly yours cannot be taken. It can be ignored. It can be overlooked. It can be underestimated for years by people who never looked carefully enough. But the thing that belongs to you, built by your character, confirmed by the people who saw you most clearly, has a way of finding its correct position. It is not magic. It is not luck. It is the long, unglamorous work of becoming someone that the right forces recognize when the time comes. And finally, she did not wait because she was weak. She waited because she understood that timing is everything, and that the woman who knows when to move is always more powerful than the woman who simply moves loudly. Strategic patience is not passive. It is the most active thing a person can do when everything around them is trying to rush them into reacting before they are ready. Renee was never not ready. She was simply waiting for the moment to be right. That moment came. She was ready, and the rest, all $18.3 billion of it, all the silence and the consequence and the morning light through the office window. The rest is what happens when a woman builds something that cannot be shaken and then simply stands in it. If Renee's story moved something in you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that silence is not weakness, and that what belongs to you will always find its way back. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. More stories like this are coming. Don't miss them.